Hello everyone, it's a pleasure to make your acquaintance. I know I missed some of the recent guides, but we're getting back to things today with the new Imaginarium Theater, and there's a bunch of changes that have both happened with this theater and the 6.0 theater that I need to cover in detail. And so, well, that's a good place to start, so let's take a look at the new content and the Arcanum stages. The most significant change that took place in 6.0 was that they added 2 whole new stages and a new difficulty to Imaginarium Theater. These 2 stages are the Arcanum stages. They are the highest difficulty, the enemies in them are level 100, the same as Act 10, but you can take them on at any point throughout your run. But obviously, if you want to amass the most buffs and strength for them, you'll save them until right at the end, as that way you'll have the most blessing levels and reaction buffs to make your character stronger. I'll cover the mechanics of the difficulties of those stages later on, as there is some consistency between versions, especially in the first Arcanum stage, but we'll look at that later when we look at the acts specifically. But not only that, that new difficulty requires now 28 to 32 characters, which is 4 more characters than before. Not only does that need you to own even more characters at level 70 to access it, but requiring that often means that those extra characters you now acquired are not particularly strong ones, and so you have to dispense your characters more carefully in the stages. And because there's harder stages now, you have to balance your teams appropriately, knowing that there's still going to be many more difficult enemies at the end. And along with the 12 stages, we now have 12 stars we can acquire, and they've added new rewards for, first of all, completing those later stages, but also starring all the stages. So I can't anymore say you're happy to leave one of those stages, you don't need to complete it, because now you need to start all of the stages to get maximum rewards. Needing this many characters also makes it impossible for me to do 4-star only runs now, so I've had to start taking the standard banner characters, like Mona, Tainari and Ka-Ching. But even doing so, I notice a significant jump in the difficulty of it requiring that many more characters, and I have to plan my teams a lot more specifically now. Those characters you used to borrow to carry you through the most difficult stages, now there's more difficult stages for them to carry you through, so a borrowed C6 can't just get you through 8 and 10, you might have to use them on 10 and Arcana 2, or something like that. So along with these changes that have increased the difficulty, they've also added some nicer buffs. The trial characters are now a bit stronger, they're all level 90. And in this new Lunar difficulty, when you're inviting a character, you get an option of 3 instead of 2. And lastly, they've added some new mystery cache options, such as one that reduces the cost of the specific invite from 100 to 80. That will give you 20 flowers, the currency, if you take a specifically randomly selected character into the next combat stage. And that's most of the important changes, and I also wanted to add 1 or 2 notes of things that have changed for me now. Mystery caches, I always, early on, decide to take the ones that give me more mystery cache options. That's because they come exclusively with the free mystery caches. This is because the rewards from those mystery caches aren't really significant, but the ones from the mystery caches that cost 15 or 40 are very significant and can give you a lot of rewards. To be able to access the better ones from those, you want to make sure you can get as many options as possible. The other big change that's taken place in this version in particular is that they've changed the amount of options you have in combat. Before, we used to be able to pick between 6 different sets of enemies. Now that's changed, we only have 3 to pick from. That comes with some benefits and some negatives. There's less choice paralysis now. It's much easier to identify the stages which are more friendly to your characters. But at the same time, because we have less options, it means there's a smaller chance of your character having a stage that's ideal to them. If they put in difficult to deal with enemies that say have a mechanic that wants you to bring a very specific character to it, they end up being more prominent. And you'll see that as we go through the acts later. Anyway, that should be most of the changes covered. If I've missed anything or you think of something significant, feel free to put it down in the comments. So let's take a look at this Imaginarium Theater. As always, we'll look at the elements first, which are Hydro, Electro, and Dendro. That gives you access to quite a variety of reactions. With Hydro and Electro, we obviously have Electro Charge and the new Lunar Charge. And for Electro and Dendro, we have the whole Catalyze reaction, which is if you combine them, you get a Quicken aura on an enemy, which is like a coexisting Dendro aura. Then when you hit an enemy that has that aura with Electro or Dendro, you'll either trigger Spread to increase your Dendro damage, or Aggravate, if it's Electro, to increase your Electro damage. For Hydro and Dendro, we of course have Bloom, and when you add Electro to that, you also get Hyperblooms. Hyperblooms were really the core of my run and carried me through a lot of the combats when I didn't have particularly strong characters. And while I did invest a lot into the Bloom route because Hyperbloom is a super valuable reaction, Electrocharge reactions are also valuable for Flynn's teams as he's a really strong character. And there's also certain characters that can make very good use of either Spread or Aggravate, and so depending on the characters you have, it can be worth investing in different routes and different reactions. The last thing I want to talk about for reactions is how all three of them sometimes mesh together. If you have Electrocharge on an enemy, that's a coexisting Electro and Hydro. So when you apply Dendro to that, the Electro and the Dendro react first to create a Quicken on the enemy. But a Quicken is just a Dendro existing on the enemy, and so the Dendro then combines with the remaining Hydro to create a Bloom Seed. If you have any extra Dendro, that will also react with the Hydro to get another Bloom Seed. And so if you're putting Dendro onto an Electrocharge enemy, you get lots of Bloom Seeds essentially. But because of the way Dendro works, you'll likely end up with a Dendro aura. That's because if you apply Dendro to Hydro, it eats a lot of the Hydro away. Whereas if you put Hydro onto Dendro, it only eats a little bit of the Dendro away. That's why in a classic Bloom team with say Nilo, Kokomi, and Nahida, build full Elemental Mastery on Kokomi. This is because by applying Hydro to the Dendro, and because Nahida applies a lot of Dendro, you can maintain Dendro on the enemy, you get more seeds and more blooms for every single hit of Hydro you do. The other way the three elements sometimes mesh together is if you have a Quicken aura on an enemy. A Quicken aura is simply when you combine Electro and Dendro, but it creates a Dendro aura on the enemy. And so if you apply Hydro to that, that will just turn into a Bloom. Because the Electro isn't also existing there, it just helped create this special Dendro aura. I hope you found this somewhat helpful and not too complicated. If you like this, let me know. If you didn't like it, let me know. I didn't want to go into too much detail, but I thought it might be helpful to at least mention these things. Now we're done with the reactions, let's move on to the characters that are significant and feel very strong this theatre. And unsurprisingly, the newest ones are definitely worth a mention, Flynn's and Inefa. Flynn's really wants Aino in his team first of all to get that Ascendant Gleam. He also needs you to not run a Dendro character so you can actually proc Lunar Charge, as a Dendro character would likely just eat away the Hydro. The other thing about him specifically using Lunar Charge is that you'll also want Lunar Charge blessings for him, but he might be the only Electrocharge team you're running. The rest of them might be all, say, Hyperbloom teams, so that's a bit awkward to work around. But him and Inefa are super useful for the Knuckle Duckle boss. Neuvillette and Farina are somewhat a pair these days, but are strong characters in their own rights. Neuvillette works really well with a variety of reactions, doesn't need too much buffing, and is very suited to multi-target and single-target content. And Farina can buff up any reasonable damage dealer. Thing with Farina is if you're making teams around Elemental Mastery reactions, so Bloom teams or Hyperbloom teams, her buff won't be providing much because the main damage in those teams is going to be the reactions. Neuvillette is also very useful for the last boss in Act 10, the Emperor of Fire and Iron, because he can hit the horns on its head which are pyro infused, breaking the pyro ward a lot more easily than a lot of other characters. Farina's minions also help with this, but the problem with Farina is that you'd have to save her all the way from the first act to the last act because she's an opening character. Veracet is a super strong damage dealer that's just very good without needing too many buffs on her team. And to benefit her a little more this theatre, there's not too many other teams that want Ian-san because of the reaction nature of a lot of carries. She'll be useful for the second Arcana stage, but keep in mind that a lot of the enemies this theatre want you to bring specific elements or reactions or ward breaking, and Veracet doesn't fulfill them too well. Also have the other new pairing of Lauma and Nefer. Lauma is super strong in her own right because she can buff any of these hyperbloom or bloom teams to incredible heights. Not too much pressure on her teammates, you just have to make sure the right characters have the elemental mastery stats. Nefer, who pairs very well with Loma, is a very good damage dealer in those Lunar Bloom teams. And lastly, I want to highlight Kuki, Raiden, and Nefer, who, in spite of having their other archetypes available, are arguably some of the best Hyper Bloom reaction triggerers in the game. So if you want to build teams with just random Dendro and Hydro characters, and then you slot in one of these three characters with a full Elemental Mastery build, you can pretty much clear any stage, because of the very high Hyperbloom damage you'll be getting. As far as blessings go, down the Electro Charge route, I wouldn't like to take the one that gives more utility of healing and energy, because that means you're sacrificing getting some damage for getting those stats instead. But once I actually prefer the non-purely damage route for the Bloom route, because getting those extra cores adds so much value. And for the Dendro Electro, the Catalyze route, you can either go the damage route or the buffing characters. As usual, pick the blessings based upon the characters you have. If you have very strong characters, pick the blessings that improve their damage. If you have quite weak characters, pick the blessings that do a lot of damage for you. So let's take a look at the opening characters. As previously mentioned, we have Farina, who's very strong, has good off-field application of Hydro that doesn't really have any requirements to it. For her burst, for the damage buff, you will want a healer in your team. With both Dendro and Hydro, there's a lot of healer units there, so that shouldn't be too much of a problem. Talking about healers, two of the other opening characters are both Barbara and Yao Yao. Neither of them are particularly strong damage-wise, but they do offer elemental application of their respective elements. I in fact ran Barbara on a sacrificial weapon just so she could get more uptime on her Hydro application. We have Sino, who's a bit of an older damage dealer and needs quite a lot of energy to be able to constantly burst, so you should pair them with an Electro character when you can. Sino works well in Aggravate or Hyperloom, where he's there triggering the reactions. We have another damage dealer, but instead of being Electro, it's Dendro. We have Alhaitham. Alhaitham, along the same lines, can either be used as a character to apply Dendro for more Hyperblooms. Both Sino and Alhaitham really want to build Elemental Mastery, unlike Auron. Auron is a support who's all built around either having another Natlan damage dealer in the team, or triggering Electro Charge. And so just like Flynn's, you'll probably want to put him in an Electro Charge team without much or any Dendro, unless you specifically use him just for the damage bonus buff he gives, where he won't be doing much damage at all. The guest characters, we have Arakino. Arakino kind of fits awkwardly into a lot of the options we have. You won't really want to put her in any Dendro teams because you will either get Burning or Burgeon, but she doesn't really like to build Elemental Mastery, or at least that much unless you're doing some kind of Melt team, and so ideally you put her in a Vape team. Or an Over Vape team, where you've got Electro Charge going on, Arakino attacks them, she gets both a Vape and an Overload. The other issue with Arakino is that we have no access to Bennett, and she really likes Bennett for his attack buff. I can use Ian-san, but then she has to dash around, it's a bit more awkward. You get the idea. We have Zhongli, who's a Geo unit. His elemental application isn't really significant, but while he has his shield on, he drops the resistance of all enemies nearby by 20% to all elements, which means he's universally useful whether you're using an Electro carry, a Hydro carry, or a Dendro carry, and he doesn't interrupt reactions too much. You have Diona, who's a Cryo healer, and at C6 she gives all on-fielders a 200 elemental mastery buff. If you therefore have an on-fielder that likes elemental mastery, like Sino or Nefer, they can make very good use of this buff. Diona, providing a little bit of Krai, also lets you freeze enemies, but more significantly, she can help you extend the use of some of your Dendro. This is especially useful when we have teams that might not have a great Dendro application, but you still want to play a Hyperbloom or Bloom team. Here, when you apply Hydro to an enemy that's got Cryo and Dendro on them, it will trigger Freeze first, eat some of that Hydro away, and so you get more use out of that Dendro that's on the enemy. So Diona can be cool in those teams. And lastly, we have Lynette, who is our only source of Viridescent Venera this theatre. And having VV can be very useful. You can put her with Flynn's or Sethos in an Aggravate team. Because while Dendro has Deepwood, Hydra and Electro don't have much access to Resistance Shred. Talking about Deepwood, the last thing before we go into the general tips is I wanted to talk about some builds. So you should equip a bunch of characters with Deepwood, especially if you're doing Hyperbloom or Bloom teams or have Dendro carries, as having those characters as supportive options will be super useful. Buffs any Dendro damage teams by quite a margin. It goes for the 4-star Instructors set. This set gives your whole team 125 Elemental Mastery for 8 seconds after that character triggers a reaction while they're on field. While it's not got the best uptime, and you're giving these characters 4-star artifacts, meaning they might have to struggle more without good artifacts, the buff it gives is very valuable. Artifacts can be more useful than things like Noblesse that you'd normally put on support characters when you're wanting to do more elemental reactions. Most important thing I think for your teams and your builds going into this theater is knowing who has the elemental mastery, who's triggering the reactions. Because one character will need to build elemental mastery if they're playing a Hyperbloom team, that Electro character, but neither the Dendro or the Hydro character will get any reaction buffing from building elemental mastery there. Similar concept applies for a Bloom team. Whichever isn't the dominant element, whichever's triggering the reactions, that character will want to have elemental mastery to get the most out of the reactions you're triggering. Hopefully that makes sense, and you might have to plan out your teams a little bit more beforehand. Along the same lines, if you have 2 Electro units in a team and they both trigger those reactions, say one character's got a lot of elemental mastery and the other one doesn't, if the other character that hasn't got the elemental mastery ends up stealing away some of those reactions, you can stop yourself from getting a lot of damage. So thinking about the compositions is slightly more complicated this time around as well, rather than just going, Gabunga, I'll just throw some elements together. Okay, well that's a lot of preamble versus usual, but hopefully that all aids you, and let's get into the general tips and then we can get into the acts. So for the general tips, as usual, I'll try to speed through it. Remember to save characters for particular stages, but we'll have a look at that when we go through every single act. Plan out the teams beforehand if you need to, and really in depth, you can even write down which characters you want to use for which acts and hope that you get them. It might take you a few retries, but it can be worth doing if you're really struggling. Making a good balance of damage dealers and supports is essential, as if you end up with a team of all carries and on-fielders, you're going to lack a lot of damage. Bonus weapons and building a lot of energy can be useful on characters when you don't know what kind of team they're going to end up in. Without having a character with a Favonius weapon, they don't have enough energy to burst consistently, so make sure to equip your characters as healthfully as possible. We've already gone over the mystery caches earlier, but take mystery caches when you can, they're almost universally useful. Always, if you can, borrow a support character from a friend, especially if you can get a good strong one. They can carry you through some stages that you might not have been able to otherwise. Alternate characters I mentioned, remember they might stop you from getting certain reactions or inhibit them. They don't get any blessings related to them. To compensate for that, they do get double the amount of blessing level buffs. Blessing level buffs are things you get for bringing extra characters over the base number for selected difficulty. Get 2 levels for each character. Every time you get a blessing in your run, that also gives you a blessing level. Blessing levels give your characters element mastery, attack, HP, defense, a lot of useful stats. Make sure to prioritize which characters get the good artifacts and weapons. Giving them to your characters that are doing the majority of the damage have a bigger impact than giving them to supports which are just focused around buffing. And lastly, think about the characters that rely on certain reactions. This theater, Mualani, feels fairly redundant, seeing as we have very little pyro access, Arcana being the only one, and no avatars of lava that self-infuse with pyro, so you can hardly make use of her kit. It might even be useful putting her on a scroll set to buff up some other characters. Okay, let's get into the acts. So you can see we only have 3 acts to choose from now. For me, I find the rune machines a lot easier than the others. But neither of the others have really any problematic mechanics. You just need to think about your positioning for gathering enemies together, such as moving towards the ranged character or knocking the lighter character nearer the others. And for Act 2, I preferred fighting the one with the smaller number of Saurian warriors. In both Act 1 and Act 2, I was able to clear with Trial Sino, Barbara, Yao Yao, and an Electro 4-star character, someone like Sarah or Beidou. But Act 2 was certainly not the easiest. I had to think carefully about how to position myself so I could trigger as many reactions as possible and hit all of the enemies at once. I tried to fight the automaton, I just didn't have enough damage. But taking these characters to these stages meant I got rid of some of the weaker characters I didn't want earlier, which is something you should try to do. And then in Act 3, we're facing the Maguu Kenki. This isn't the triple Kenki, this is just the single one on its own, meaning you want to focus on more single target damage. Me, I consistently brought Trial Hythem, Trial Farina, and an Electro Hyperbloom triggerer like Kuki to this stage, which made clearing it quite easy. No strong resistances, just at 70% HP he will start an attack where he becomes invulnerable until he's completed it, and shortly after that, if you're attacking him in melee range, he will want to dash you back away from you, and then shortly after that dash back to the center. You can kind of manipulate him to not do this by standing outside of his arena of decision making. He doesn't detect that you're in melee range and won't want to dash away from you. This can also mean taking a ranged character makes him a little bit easier to fight than a melee character. But the Maguu Kenki has not got any more mechanics than that to them. After that, we're onto the Monolith stage, Act 4, but there's been some pretty big changes here. I think they got clued up on the idea of us just aggroing enemies and never defeating them and taking whatever units, and they've now added at least 3 enemies you'll be facing at the same time. These aren't particularly strong enemies, the automaton now has 2 electro slimes with them. It's hard to distract all 3 of these enemies at the same time. Say you only distract the automaton and leave the electro slimes, they will do enough damage to that monolith that means that you lose the star. And so now you have to actually take a character that's competent at dealing with it. Luckily, they've given us elemental slimes, and so you can really capitalize on that. What ended up being my favourite stage for this act was going against the Rune Machine and the Hydro Slimes, as this let me get free Electro Charges or free Blooms if I wanted them, without needing to bring a Hydro character. And then I used all of these free reactions I was getting to do more damage to the Rune Machine. The same should apply for the Electro Slimes. As always, I avoided the large section of Rune Machines, they're just annoying to deal with because there's so many of them. Something else I want to note for this stage is that they have nerfed the self damage you get from Blooms now. And this also seems to affect the Monolith. Before, in teams when you did a lot of Bloom damage, some of that Bloom damage would end up hurting the Monolith quite severely. But that seems to not be as appropriate now. I was able to clear just with Cave on their own basically. Worth keeping in mind for these Monolith stages is that defeating any of the enemies will reduce the timer by about 8 seconds. So you can choose to just focus down the weaker enemies, the slimes, which are much easier to defeat, and they will reduce the timer by the same amount as defeating the harder enemies. For Act 5, they still give us the option of fighting the bigger Rune Machines, so I always choose that one. The fact that they group themselves up makes it really easy to trigger reactions and deal damage to multiple of them at a time. And they don't have any dash attacks like the Kairagi, they just kind of sit there. In Act 6, we have the battle-hardened Primordial by Vishap. This is the local legend that you can find in the Sea of Bygone Eras. First thing to note is that it has really high Hydro resistance, so Hydro damage deals are significantly less effective. In fact, I would recommend taking an Aggravate or a Spread team here. And before we look at the main mechanic, I also want to say Vishaps, all Vishaps, have a unique attack to them, that if you get hit by it and you're not shielded or you don't dodge it, it can drain your character's energy. If you have no energy, this attack does significantly more damage. So taking characters that aren't reliant on energy can also be nice. This is amplified further when we look at its main mechanic. About 30 seconds into the chamber, it will generate a large Hydro ward on itself, gaining a lot of resistances. It has this ward of 16 units, it generates a field around itself which will continually drain all of your characters out of energy. If you have a Zhongli pillar, you can just stand on top of that and the drain won't affect you. But if you don't stay away from it, as it will chase you down, you'll end up losing 10 energy every half a second. As most bursts cost 60 energy, that means all of your character's bursts and energy will be drained in just 3 seconds. You then run out of energy, the active character will start losing 10% of their HP instead, and so it can be quite dangerous. Luckily, we have access to Dendro and Electro. As we were talking about reactions earlier, You might remember, Dendro takes away a lot of Hydro from wards, and so you only need 8 hits of Dendro to remove all of the Hydro. An Electro Charge decreases Hydro but quite slowly. It ticks about once a second, so that will take you then 16 seconds if you're just using Electro. If you take both Electro and Dendro, you can proc both the Dendro on the enemy to break the shield, but if you proc Dendro when there's Electro on them and they have an Electro Charge, that becomes a Quicken Aura. That Quicken Aura becomes Dendro, Dendro interacts with the Hydro, so it just removes the Hydro from them, this Hydro ward, even faster. After this ward is destroyed, they go back to their regular resistances, still having high Hydro resistance, but you can take care of the rest of the HP bar. So, on to Act 7. Act 7 is probably the example of the most awkward assortment of enemies they'll give us. We have the Weasel, who can be dealt with easily if you have a plunging character. The only plunging characters we really have access to are Varessa. We have some of the Tenebrous Papilla, which generate Void Wards, but these Void Wards will want you to bring a Natlan character, ideally, to deal with them as fast as possible, and one with lots of hits. I have Kaniche, but we don't have PMC, we don't have Mawika, we don't have Silali. If you do end up against them, just remember you need lots of hits, and Hyperbloom and reactions count as hits. Running a team like Jincho and Fischl and Nahida can generate those Hyperblooms and hits very fast. The problem is they're very valuable characters this theatre. So the last option, my in fact preferred option, is the Abyss Lectors, the 2 Pyro Abyss Lectors. For these, you just have to make sure you, at the start of the chamber, move far away from them, staying in a line so that they gather together. As long as you have okay Hydro application, you can deal with them. For example, I used Mona to get me through this stage. Because of the limited choices, Act 7 is now, instead of being an act where you pick an enemy appropriate to the characters you have, you need to plan out beforehand the characters you intend to take which enemy with. And Act 8 is the Knuckle Duckle, the new Nod Krai boss. Knuckle Duckle will really want you to bring an Electro Charge or a Lunar Charge team. That's because right at the start of the combat, they will summon 5 ducks. And until all of these ducks are defeated, they have 150 resistance. The ducks have about a quarter of the HP of the boss, so you can't get through them with just damage. The way to defeat them is by proccing Electro Charge or Lunar Charge on them 10 times. Electro Charge happens more often and will take you 10 seconds about to do this. But whereas Lunar Charge happens only every 2 seconds, if you have Inefa or Flynn's, they can directly proc Lunar Charge with some of their damage, so they get extra hits that way, so the time ends up being quite similar. After each duck is defeated, the duck will then shoot towards Knuckle Duckle and do 5% true damage to it. And once you've defeated all 5 ducks, it loses that high resistance. There are some small notes for taking care of the ducks themselves. They don't group terribly well, and so characters that have somewhat AoE application of their Electro and Hydro are more useful than single target. Someone like Lynette can help in those situations spread the reactions around with Swirl. But the damage you do to them isn't important. Only if you're doing a Lunar Charge team do you need to on-field Flynn's. After all of the ducks are defeated, the boss will be paralyzed for about 14 seconds. Before getting up and resuming its attack pattern. It can do some annoying attacks where it jumps in the air and dodges some of your damage, so if you have big damage like Flynn's burst, make sure to wait until it's landed before using his burst. The other annoying part about this fight is that you'll actually only have about 50 seconds to do damage to the boss, at least if you want to star it. This is because after 50 seconds, after you defeat all the ducks, it will then start the duck mechanic anew. And with 10 seconds left, you're not going to defeat all the ducks in time. So you need to defeat this boss in a total of 70 seconds, unlike the 80 seconds the timer says. Also, don't bring Dendro here. If you bring Dendro here, that will stop you from triggering Electro Charge. Act 9 is the focus target round, where you have to defeat a few elites ignoring the rest of the common enemies around them. Personally, I found the Rift Hounds the most annoying, but none of them to be super problematic. It's simply because with the Rift Hounds, they move around so much that it's much harder to focus them if you have someone that doesn't have the best targeting. End up hitting the smaller Rift Hounds instead of the elites quite often, and they have the corrosion damage to go with them. Whereas both the Kairagi and the automatons generally sit pretty pretty happily in one spot. Now, before we go on to Act 10, because we're at the end, you'll want to do the Arcana stages now. After all the blessings, you're as empowered as you can be, so let's take a look at Arcana 1. This proved the most difficult stage for me this theatre, mainly because I didn't respect the mechanics enough. Arcana 1, this theatre, and last theatre has a mechanic where it will continually do damage to your characters. The amount of damage increases as time goes on, going through 3 different stages. And so I highly recommend bringing a team-wide competent healer if you can. I was trying to clear this stage with Kuki and Healer Farina, and I only just about managed it by the skin of my teeth, having to constantly swap around the different characters to make sure they were topped up on health. Please don't do that to yourself. Take a team-wide healer. I would even say Yao Yao's not great on her own. You have to spend time on fielding her with her burst. Maybe if you're playing a hyperbloom team where you've Candace infused her, but yeah. I would rather recommend using on-field Kokomi, using Baiju, using Sijui, even Barbara if you've managed to save her all the way to the end. But definitely plan ahead for this stage and make sure you know which healer you're bringing to get through it. If you don't have a good team-wide healer, make sure you have plenty of damage so you can get through the stage really fast. And hopefully because of that you'll need less healing in general. The stage itself says you have 6 minutes to complete it, but every time you defeat an enemy that reduces the timer by 15 seconds. And so to defeat a total of 17 enemies, that timer is going to get reduced 16 times. So you only end up with about 2 minutes to get the stage done if you want the star. The enemies themselves aren't too annoying to fight. They do end up a little bit spaced out and aren't easy to group, but they don't have high mobility and they don't have really high particular resistances. There's one with a slight hydro resistance, but it's fairly insignificant. The one thing you shouldn't do is bring a shielder to this. Already taking a healer because of the nature of the stage, but if you take a shielder thinking you can mitigate more damage, it will buff up the husks when they attack you while you have a shield. It can give them healing, it can give them an elemental ward. Just don't do it, avoid it. Just make the fight much more complicated. And then you have Arcana 2. Arcana 2 has no special mechanics to it. It's really you're just fighting a second Act 10 boss. Thankfully, you're fighting the PMA here, and the PMA has no special requirements. You don't need a particular element, you don't need a reaction to deal with it. The only mechanic it has is once you get it down to about 35% HP, it becomes invulnerable and splits apart into 4 smaller rune machines. 2 of the rune machines have higher health than the others. The lower health ones are going to be the snake-like one and the cruiser one, which is the little floating one. As to get it back in its form, you only need to defeat the rune machine that has the golden ring of glowing runes around it. You can just reset until the ring of runes is round one of the lower health ones. You can also position around the rune machines to get them to move closer to the core of the PMA. So after you've defeated the rune machine, you're ready to damage the core of the PMA right away. The rune cruiser will dash backwards away from you. The snake can do a tunnel towards you, and the crab can jump towards you. You'll want to be near the core of the PMA because after you defeat the marked rune machine, the PMA will be vulnerable, having much lower resistances for a short period of time, about 14 seconds. And after this, it will go back to having regular resistances and start the whole process again, doing its mechanic again after about 40 seconds or so. Hopefully you're done with your Arcana stages and we can get back to Act 10. The final act is against the Emperor of Fire and Iron. The Emperor of Fire and Iron has really high pyro resistance, so don't take Arcana for this. And almost as soon as battle starts, the Emperor of Fire and Iron will generate a big pyro ward on the horns on its head. This pyro ward is worth 16 units, and it being on top of it is significant. This means some abilities will struggle to hit the horns on the top, whereas some will hit it really easily. Taking someone like Nervlet, who the big hitbox of their Hydro Beam goes all over the enemy, can break the ward quite easily. Whereas smaller attacks like Kokomi normal attacks won't be able to hit it. And you'll want to break this ward as soon as possible because while it has a huge amount of increased resistance. Unlike other bosses though, here it will become stunned for about 10 seconds after you break that ward. If you are struggling to break the ward, when it does certain attacks where it plunges itself into the ground slightly, where it like leaps up or burrows itself During that time period, it's a lot easier to hit the horns on the head with a lot of the Hydro attacks. If you have brief periods of bursts of Hydro, make sure to time those appropriately. I'd also recommend taking some Electro over Dendro in this stage, as Electro obviously also does damage to Pyro wards, whereas Dendro would only proc burning, doesn't do any damage to it. And so an ideal team for this would be someone like Nervalet, Farina, Inefa, as you'll get plenty of large AoE Hydro damage to break the ward, and Inefa will provide some extra Electro to help towards that. Unlike most bosses though, the boss will only end up paralyzed on the floor for about 10-ish seconds here. And only about 25 seconds after you first broke the ward, it will tunnel underground and regenerate it, meaning you have to break it a second time. But hopefully you managed to do that and you cleared this stage and we got to the end of Imaginarium Theater. Or maybe you just used this for one of the easier versions. Either way, I hope you found it helpful, and if you have any feedback or thoughts or comments in general, it's always appreciated. In fact, any kind of interaction support, whether that's subscribing for more endgame guides in the future, liking my videos, following me on Twitter, joining the Discord, any of that. It's always super appreciated. Anyway, I hope you found this helpful, as I said, and have a lovely rest of your day. I've been watchful. Bye bye!